feel free to put comments in the chat or the Q&A box as well. So our final discussant today is Dr. Anthony Mann from the OECD, and Anthony's going to reflect on our policy briefs as well. I'm going to put myself on mute, Anthony, and let you do your show.
All right, thanks so much. And thank you for the invitation. It's been fascinating, really interesting, and I really love the approach that you're taking. I think I can probably learn something about that myself for some of the work that we do. I think I probably would say that it would be useful to have a bit more about methodology as we're going to go through the papers. But I learned a lot, and I found it really very helpful, very efficient way of getting across a lot of knowledge. I'm going to put in the chat. I'm going to try again to put some links into some of the things which I'm just going to touch upon. I think what I've got to say is actually going to align quite nicely with what Annalene had to say. So I work at the OECD, and here, so based in Paris, we have about 40 countries. Our job is to, make better policy by working with countries and comparing across countries and helping to learn from each other. And I think one thing I just start by saying is that there is a very strong interest from governments in this whole of this agenda. One thing I've been involved in the last few months is updating what is called a youth action plan, a youth recommendation, which is going to be hopefully endorsed by sort of governments. And people will see for themselves, the nature of the approaches which governments feel should be made generally to addressing some of the problems of youth. And there may be sort of disagreement about the nature of the responses or the detail of the responses, but where governments are is very much in line with what this session this morning has all been about. Very deep concern about youth employment, but also about psychological well-being and engagement of young people. And there's a feeling that the sort of mega trends which were being highlighted at the beginning of the session are really going to sort of like work continually to the disadvantage of young people. In our work looking at automation and digitalization, when we sort of like break down particular jobs which are at greatest risk of digitalizations, disproportionately they are jobs which young people do, entry-level jobs. A lot of concern, of course, about COVID and the impacts that had, and the long-term impact that it might have, because within this turbulent labour market, within a lot of countries, experiencing recession, there is deep concern going back to the great financial crisis, where it took 10 years for the average rates of youth unemployment on average across the OECD to return to the levels which we saw in 2007, 2008. So we're encountering a situation where there is a need for policy interventions. Recently, my work has been focused on vocational education and training, but also career guidance and career readiness, particularly looking at secondary school students. And I'm going to touch a little bit on some of the studies which we've been involved in recently, which I think relate to the work which you're all involving. Over the last year, we've been looking at national longitudinal data sets. So we identified data sets in 10 countries, including the UK, and we looked what evidence we could find that the sort of experiences, the activities, the attitudes that young people demonstrated in relationship to their career prospects at 15, typically at 15, can relate to outcomes in employment at age 25. And in looking at longitudinal data sets, these go back some time, but we looked at them at periods of declining youth unemployment and rising youth unemployment. And we found some very strong trends. We found ultimately that we could identify 11 indicators of better employment outcomes. These relate to the way that young people actively explore their futures. And it goes from something which could be seen as being quite small, which might be participation in a career conversation or participation in activities laid on by schools. For example, job fairs or workplace visits, to things which are more substantial, which might be participation in a short vocationally focused program. But we found that exploration was really important in its own right. Activities to actually actively explore the labour market, how it might relate to an individual. Secondly, first-hand experiences, particularly through part-time working and volunteering. Lots of new evidence around volunteering. And then thirdly, we found that teenage career thinking is associated with better outcomes. And by that, we mean that we looked at questions around the extent to which young people, have a clear occupational expectation at 15. And if they do, then it doesn't need to be doesn't need to stay the same, but if they do better later on. And similarly, if they're able to draw a connection between what they're doing in school to where they want to do later on, so they agree with statements like, if I work hard at school, it'll help me get a good job. We find there that, again, we find that these attitudes, this ability to draw a connection between education experience to have an informed perspective is linked to better outcomes later on. And within this, we see, I think, some elements of the tools and resources which papers have called for young people to be equipped with in order to demonstrate the agency which societies increasingly expect of them. And so if you look at kind of across OECD countries and really across the world, as a generation, young people have never been in education for longer. They've never left education more highly qualified, and they are having to make multiple decisions about their education and training as they go through this process. But are we giving them the tools to allow them to do better? And what we find when we look at the longitudinal data sets, we find consistent evidence related to lower NEET rates, higher earnings, and greater job satisfaction or career satisfaction. Our problem is, the challenge is that too few students are accessing such effective sort of like guidance. We have data from about 30 countries, and there we look at just take two aspects of the sort of guidance systems which schools can put in place. One is the career talk or job fair. A second one would be workplace visits or job shadowing. You put the two together and say, have you done both of these? And have you also spoken to a guidance counsellor to prepare for, to reflect on, to develop that sort of like critical engagement? And here we find that fewer than 20% of students across the OECD countries have engaged in this sort of activity. And we think this is kind of like particularly important because young people are at a place where they can still make some conscious decisions about managing their engagement in education and training before they're exposed to the what can sometimes be a very hostile like labour market. We find as well, one of the themes which has been clear in these sessions is that the risks of poor outcomes are by no means equally shared. We find particular concern around lower achievers. Often young people from more disadvantaged social backgrounds, of course, but we focus particularly on the lower achievers because these are students who we can expect to go into the labour market very quickly. And often they're showing that they're much more likely to be uncertain or confused about their futures. And these are both indicators associated with worse outcomes, but also often having less exposure to the sorts of activities which we've been able to identify as being ones which we can have a fair degree of confidence that across different countries there are positive outcomes which will be associated with. And I want to sort of like finish by sort of like highlighting three approaches which I think speak a lot to a slightly older group, young people maybe in their late teens, early 20s, which we've uncovered or come across in our work. And we feel provide a really good model for understanding how young people's economic prospects, but also their psychological prospects can be supported, could be better supported, better protected, better nurtured by education systems as they go through. And the first is a program in the United States. There's a college called Gutman College in New York. They run a program called Ethnographies of Work. And through that, they take their students and they give them work placements, internships and so on. But the whole point of that is that they're going to critically investigate what that workplace is actually like. They have an ethnographic approach, an anthropological approach. And for us, that fits with an idea that we really want young people to be developing a critical understanding, a better critical understanding about how work works, a more realistic understanding, perhaps, a more informed understanding about how some people get jobs, other people don't, who prospers, who doesn't prosper, but be able to do that while they're still in an educational setting. And the Ethnographies of Work program is one which is underpinned by exposure to the literature on work and theoretical approaches as well as a practical element. A second one would be a program in Finland, which is delivered by vocational schools, which are working with young people who are 17, 18 years old. And they take 1 week towards the very end of their schooling it's called the School to Work Group Method, to take 20 hours to work collaboratively, as people who can learn from each other, but to really sort of reflect upon, what work's like, how their transitions are going to get planned. They speak to employers, they interview them. The program aims to help to learn to think like an employer. And in randomized controlled trials, participants who take part in this 20-hour program do better later on economically, but also psychologically. They do better, and that kind of links to the work I'm sure many people here know that Matt Deemer in the United States has done, which we're interested in thinking about our ongoing work, which is around critical consciousness. And again, longitudinal studies have been used to show that the way that young people have a more informed understanding about how societies work and how economic structures work. It makes it, they're associated with better psychological and economic outcomes. And I think this also speaks to, a desire to really equip young people to be able to, not just really manage, manage their decision making, their transitions professionally, but also to do so emotionally and psychologically. And I'll just finish by highlighting that, this is the generation which is staying in education longer than ever before. They're more qualified than ever before, but also they're more ambitious than ever before. We ask young people in the PISA studies what sort of jobs they expect to have when they're age 30. 64% of them nowadays say they're going to work as a professional or as a manager. Those ISCO categories 1 or 2, those jobs. 20 years ago, it was more like 50%. So we've got a very ambitious generation, and that raises concerns as they enter a labour market which has a lot of challenges in early navigation, but also doesn't have often that demand for labour. So I put in the chat there some of our references of work that we're involved in. And we, as I say, I'm working the directorate school for education, so I'm most interested in what happens at secondary school. But it's been super useful to me to engage with what's happening for young people as they get older and as they struggle to find their place in the adult labour market.
Well, thank you so much for the overview, Anthony. I think we have covered quite comprehensive groups of themes, and it was really nice to hear from both Anthony and Annalene on how these different topics come together and how they make sense in their different domains as well. Now, I know there's been some chat going on in terms of the problems persisting across time and contexts. If anyone would like to pick up on those topics, please do share your thoughts in the chat or specific questions in the questions and answers. And also a bit of housekeeping that I need to do for ourselves, but also for the ESRC, is to hear your evaluations or your thoughts of the webinar. So put a link there if you could fill in a short survey. I think you will also get a similar link after the event from EVOP as well.
Could I ask a quick question for Anthony and maybe Annalene as well? Just really interesting hearing the links between what both of you were talking about in terms of this relational concept of employability, the need for employers to be communicating with young people, and then Anthony's work about young people being able to understand the wider context that they're going into. I mean, the current situation has severely limited any of those kind of interactions happening. One example is internships or placements happening online, the difficulties with actually engaging young people and employers engaging in the real world and being able to see the kind of successful interventions that you've been talking about, Anthony, in the past. So where are we now, and maybe in the next year or so, where I think as an educator, I'm seeing this being severely curtailed in our own students as they go out into the world, and they're actually going out into the world with fewer career competencies because they've not had the opportunities to engage with employers and the world out there do their own kind of ethnographic information gathering and exploration. So this virtual world that they are in and they're entering, of course, it's not all occupations and it's not all levels, but what implications does that have for this relational conceptualization of employability?
Cool. Well, maybe I'll go first because I think I can relate perhaps a bit more strongly, our findings with Anneline's conclusions, that we find that of the indicators which we're identifying, and these are ones which we find evidence in at least 3 different countries against different outcome areas. Many of them can only be delivered with employers or people in work, or are significantly enriched by their involvement. And it tells us something which is very powerful about this relational, this contextual aspect. And then I think we ask ourselves, well, what do young people actually get from that? What is the useful thing? And I think we can see it in 2 ways. One is that we can see them gaining access to kind of new and useful information. You can see them accessing Granovetter style, non-redundant, trusted information on the one hand. And we can also see them sort of gaining opportunities for experiences to take part in activities through which they can develop skills and develop competencies. And I think, if we look at what are the characteristics which allow greatest benefit to be gained by the young person? Well, there are some things which will transcend the delivery mechanism, and I think the key thing I always see is authenticity. A young person really needs to be able to understand that they're hearing it straight, that they're not being sold something. I think there's a difference between hearing from maybe a university recruiter as opposed to somebody from work who might be a friend or a relative, or who has got no vested interest. Somebody who will tell you straight, in particular circumstances, and that's particularly valuable. If you're maybe a minority and going into a particular profession, it's very helpful to hear from somebody who can share some of your experiences. So authenticity is really important, and a volume of interactions is very important, particularly at the younger age. That's what we find, is that the more that young people engage, the more useful it's going to prove to be, for them. That's because they don't know what they don't know. They often are sort of a bit blinkered because of the expectations and assumptions that brought them to this place. So volume is really important at a younger age, making it mandatory for them to engage in some of these activities, but also sort of building in a part for reflection. So preparing beforehand, thinking about things afterwards. And, I think the jury is out on the extent to which we can, kind of replace face-to-face encounters with online encounters. And I'm sure that, that online is always going to be at a disadvantage because it takes away this, this visceral thing of sort of being face-to-face with somebody, being able to look them in the eye, seeing them smile, seeing them say that, it's actually somebody like you'd be great at this. So giving that sort of engagement. But I think if we kind of unpack the principles which are at play, this authenticity particularly, then we can optimize the chances of these programs working well. And we kind of see, in the UK and Finland, we have, online work experience, online internships. People are doing it. We need to review it, and we need to understand how we can do them really very well, because we're going to be living in this hybrid world for probably quite a while.
Maybe I can shortly add, I think I share your concern. I also see it among my own students. They're struggling with it. I have these career talks with them, and they have less opportunities for internships and work experience. But I also share what Anthony is saying. I'm really stimulating them to go and look in their own environment for people who do jobs that they're interested in, and talk to them, and it's often better than go to job fair where companies sell their own company with cars. I mean, you get a company car and you can do this and that. So I stimulate them to go for authentic witnesses. I think that's an important one. Talk to people, talk to employers, people also who don't have an interest, and I think that's important, that the relationship is built maybe online and in a different way, but we should still try and achieve contact with work experiences, I think. And they're often very used to being online, maybe more than we are. So there are opportunities, I think. But we should be aware that we just do not skip internships and say that it's not possible, so let's not do it. We should look for solutions from a relational perspective, in my point of view.
Thank you.
And in a way, that kind of going to the authentic witnesses that are kind of available around themselves runs the danger also of reinforcing some of the already existing inequalities, isn't it? Because not all of our students have access to those kinds of readily available networks within their small circles to get to. So so there's all sorts of layers going on here, I think, in this online new world.
Maybe I can add something. What I also do in my class, it's a compulsory class. I have people of all different backgrounds in my class. And so I also organize sessions where they have to interview in groups somebody, and they have to share what they learned from the interviews with each other. And so they all hear different stories from very different careers, very different experiences. I had a class yesterday, I have one this afternoon. And it's also a way, I think, of sharing. They learn a lot from each other's stories of parents, and introduce the difference in the class as well. So that they learn from the experiences of others as well and share it among each other.
And that sounds like a great way to break that barrier of only talking to people you know as well. Anthony, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think Annalene really sort of like highlights the the importance of educational institutions as democratizing access to these resources. And they clearly aren't sort of like equally distributed. And I think we've got a very substantial body of literature now, which shows that kind of social capital really does make a difference. The cultural capital, which stems from sort of the context within which people interact. These are elements which really do make a big difference. Beyond the kind of the qualifications and the skills, they're the ones which are really driving our understanding about who succeeds in different ways within the labour market. And I think, as I say, education institutions, it's their function to democratize access to these resources and make sure that it's more of an equal playing field.
Michelle, did you want to come in and because I see you've got some.
Maybe just briefly, but just to kind of pose some more nuances to how students might feel online. Quite interestingly, there were comments that some of the students made in the online community of practice that they felt that they were able to ask questions that they might have felt embarrassed about asking if they had to ask out loud in front of people, and kind of the online environment gave them the sense of security to be able to carefully craft it, edit it to a way that they were comfortable with, and felt less putting themselves out there to ask questions that they felt like they ought to have known. Just showing how complex it is, perhaps.
It's the lack of social cues as well, isn't it? You don't really know how to gauge where you're supposed to be or how you are in relation to other people as well. So my computer, I don't know if you've heard that, my computer tells me that this is the end of our 2 hours. I would like to thank all our panelists, all our contributors, and our discussants, Annalene and Anthony, for your contributions to today, and our audience as well for all your contributions in terms of comments and questions. As I mentioned, the link is there if you'd like to tell the ESRC whether you've enjoyed the webinar or not. As you've seen in our intro slides, we have started something a 1.5 years ago on youth employment, and we do intend to go on doing more events and gatherings. So keep an eye on watch the space, as they say, and thank you for your contributions and all your comments and questions, everybody. Dora and Ros, would you like to say a few words? I'm pretty sure I'm forgetting something.
Just to say thank you to all our great panelists and discussants. We're going to be subtitling this and uploading it onto our YouTube channel for the EWOP Impact Incubator, and also we'll be putting all of the briefing packs that the stellar contributors have really put together, but it's really showing about the appliance of science, and having these dialogues is critical in terms of honing really impactful briefings that link in with the real concerns of people. So thank you for everyone who's contributed to this, and also to Belgin and Dora for your work in honing and pulling us together as a team to do these briefing packs. So thank you. And Dora?
Yes, and a thank you from me as well to all our panelists and discussants today. And really just to say, we'd like this to be the beginning of the dialogue, and the EWOP Impact Incubator has given us an opportunity to do this, a platform to do this, which is really valuable. So the whole package of materials, we hope, is going to be a further stimulus to discussion. And as you can see, we've just scratched the surface of a lot of complex issues. So we hope this is a part of the continuing story and discussion. Thanks to everybody for attending as well.
Thank you. It's a wrap.
And stay safe in your various lockdowns wherever you are.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
I thought I'll just stay back just in case.
Yep, I think it's just us.
We've got
Do you want to take the
Natalia.
recording off?
That's a good question.